Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Xueguang Zhou, the director of Stanford University's Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center, or what we call APARC. Thank you all for joining us at the 2024 Shorenstein Journalism Award ceremony. Okay, this is our 23rd annual award celebration. The Shorenstein Journalism Award was established more than 2 decades ago to honor the legacy of our benefactor, Mr. Walter H. Shorenstein, who was equally passionate about promoting excellence in journalism and understanding of Asia. Walter shared with APAC's founders the belief that Asia was rising swiftly and that engaging deeply with Asian affairs and Asian counterparts was essential for America's future. All of us who knew him continue to feel his absence on the audience side of our awards celebration, where he used to sit, listening intently and asking questions. We thank the Shorenstein family for its continued support of our center. The Shorenstein Award celebrates exceptional journalists and news organizations who have made outstanding contribution to public understanding of Asia worldwide. Okay, throughout its history as an APAC-sponsored initiative, the award has alternated between recipients affiliated with American news media and those primarily affiliated with Asian news outlets. Our awardees include the late Stanley Kano, a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian and journalist, best known for his highly regarded work on East Asia and the Vietnam War, and Nobel Peace Prize laureate Maria Ressa, the founder and CEO of the Philippine news platform, a rapper and a champion of press freedom and democracy in the age of disinformation. And most recently, The Caravan, India's premier magazine of long-form narrative journalism, protecting truth and accountability in the face of India's democratic erosion. Today, we are very proud and delighted to recognize the acclaimed Chris Buckley, the chief China correspondent for the New York Times, with the 2024 Shorenstein Award. The awards judging committee notes that Chris' body of work reflects, quote, truly unparalleled knowledge and understanding of China, unquote, and vividly unveils the country's political and social transformations under Xi Jinping's rule. Okay, following his comments, he will join 2 China experts here at Stanford and our APAC community, Oriana Mastro and Xueguang Zhou, for a conversation with Will Dobson, a member of the judging committee for the Shorenstein Award. Before we proceed, I'd like to acknowledge and thank the Shorenstein Award judging committee, which includes 4 additional members who couldn't be here today. Jay Hamilton, professor here and chair of the Department of Communication and the director of the journalism program at Stanford. Anna Fifield, Asia Pacific editor for the Washington Post and our 2018 Journalism Award winner. Louisa Lim, senior lecturer, audiovisual journalism, culture and communication, University of Melbourne in Australia, and Razu Narusetti, global publishing leader at McKinsey and Corporations. Okay, now I'm going to invite Will Dobson, an eminent journalist in his own right, to introduce our honoree in more detail and co-present him with the Shorenstein Award. So please join me in welcoming Will Dobson and celebrating our honoree, Chris Buckley.
Hello, everyone. It's a privilege to be here today to introduce our honored guest and recipient of the 2024 Shorenstein Journalism Award, Chris Buckley. Delivering the types of stories and reporting that Chris has shared with readers would be difficult in any environment. Doing so in China is doubly so. I've edited and worked with correspondents in China for 20 years, and I can attest that over that period of time, the task grew more challenging. And it is the case that there are challenges for reporters in any region, unique ones. But sometimes certain things really bring it home for you when you're working in this profession. I myself remember a few years ago when I was working as a foreign editor at NPR, we had an idea for a series that was going to be focused on China. But the notion here was that we would be delivering stories about China from everywhere but China. And so the international desk worked together, bringing stories about a China unbound in Latin America and Africa and Europe and so on. And so the premise here was that, in fact, every reporter now, whether they know it or not, is to some degree or another a China reporter. And let's see how these stories come together from all these different parts of the world. And at that moment, I began to get reports from my correspondents in Latin America and Europe and Africa saying, this is really hard. And all of a sudden they said, wow, our China team, I had no idea. And I'm not even doing this work from the People's Republic. I'm doing this work in my beat in Southern Africa or East Africa or Brazil or what have you. They had a real respect for the work that their colleagues in China were putting together on a regular basis. And these are the waters in which Chris swims. I, for myself, have to say that under these extremely challenging conditions, in my view, Chris has been one of the most perceptive and sensitive chroniclers of modern China. Just consider just a small slice of some of the stories he's brought to us. How China is using high-tech surveillance to quell and control Uyghur communities in Xinjiang. Reporting on the early onset and cover-up of the coronavirus in Wuhan, staying on for an incredible 76 days to bring that story to readers. A deep and rich understanding of the rise and early thinking of Xi Jinping. At a time when the People's Republic's power has reached new heights, Chris has brought us some of the most vital and powerful stories of recent years. Chris grew up in Sydney, Australia, and began studying Chinese at the University of Sydney and Australian National University. After graduating with a degree in history, he attended Renmin University in Beijing, studying Chinese Communist Party history. He later returned to Australian National University for graduate studies at the Contemporary China Center. Chris has been the chief China correspondent for the New York Times since 2019. And before joining the Times in 2012, he was a senior correspondent in Beijing for Reuters for 7 years. Before that, he worked as a researcher and reporter for the New York Times and the International Herald Tribune. So over a really remarkable 20 years, he has been working as a reporter at what has really been a crucial moment in modern China's trajectory. Today, Chris calls Taiwan home, and he's been reporting there since 2022. If you're reading Chris these days, you have no doubt come across his lively and vivid reporting on a whole range of stories, religious pilgrimages across Taiwan, the raucous mass rallies of Taiwan's political campaign season. And I personally have been, it's little stories that he delves deep into, looking at how Taiwan's has had an innovative approach to developing its resilience against natural disasters like earthquakes that have beset the island for so long. Or, of course, in this, and it's come home to us in the headlines just in the last couple days, the mounting tensions between Beijing and Taiwan's newly elected president. As an editor, and I think for many of us as readers, what stands out for me is that Chris combines a deep curiosity with an equal measure of humility about the breadth of his subject. That combination, aided by a long study and familiarity with China, has rendered stories that bring people, places, and even the quietest moments to life. And so, for me, it is a distinct pleasure to present this year's Shorenstein Journalism Award to Chris Buckley. Chris, please join me in Ji Wook for the presentation of your award.
Thank you, Professor Shin. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you all for coming out in such numbers. It's truly humbling and gratifying to see you all here. I should say that when I first received an email from Noah Ronkin of the Shorenstein Center about this award, that earthquake had just struck Taiwan, and I was rushing around trying to figure out what I should do to cover my first major earthquake in Taiwan. So I saw the title of the email, and my first response was, this is probably one of those phishing emails that wants me to part with my banking account details. It was only after a few hours later that I actually opened the email. I realized it was legit. And I can't tell you how humbling it was to receive that email. And afterward, I was looking through the list of past recipients. Some of them are journalists who have sacrificed their freedom and risked their lives for journalism. Xueguang and Zhou from Myanmar, Maria Ressa from the Philippines, and others. The pressures that I faced in previously working in the People's Republic of China were much more mundane. And now I'm working in Taiwan, where censorship is a thing of the past and reporting conditions are much more relaxed. So this reward has come as a great surprise and a great honor to me, and I'm grateful to the center and the judges. I should also mention my thanks to my family, Hongyan and Hannah, my parents, and also long-suffering colleagues and editors as well, especially the editors. So over the next 20 minutes, I'll just share some thoughts as a warm-up to the conversation, which I hope will bring all of you into questions about reporting on China and Asia in general. I will be speaking mostly about China, and I'll have less to say about my current home, Taiwan. And that's not because Taiwan is a lesser topic by any means. It's just that I've been there for much less time. And Stanford is well known to be thickly populated with Taiwan experts. I see one or two in the audience today. And I figure I won't test them by showing off my amateurish knowledge of Taiwan at this point. But I'm sure it will come up in the discussions afterwards. As Will has already said, it hasn't been a happy time to be covering China in many ways. Restriction and harassment made the job harder over the years. Quite a few journalists for American newspapers were expelled in 2020, and I also had to leave at that time. So now some of us are in the challenging, some would say surreal position of reporting on China from the outside. But actually today, I really want to avoid dwelling too much on the miseries of being a journalist following China. My friend Emily Fong of NPR, who received her award in 2022, spoke very eloquently about those challenges. And not that much has changed from what I understand. I haven't been in China for over 4 years now. In fact, I worry that at a time when China matters so much to the world, we risk discouraging new generations from plunging into the adventure of learning about China, perhaps learning Chinese, perhaps going to China to study, and then carrying that knowledge and that experience into their careers, whether that's diplomacy, business, government, scholarship, or I dare say journalism. So that's something that concerns me, is this diminishment of people who are going into this field, and something I want to talk about later. The numbers in the United States elsewhere have shown fewer students have been studying Chinese or going to China to study, especially since COVID. That trend is understandable given the real difficulties, and for some, the real security risks of going to China these days. it's a daunting and even discouraging time to consider a career tied to China as it is now. But over time, the accumulated cost could be a loss of our pooled understanding of China and the great issues of its rise in the world. And it means a diminishing of the fresh voices we need for healthy debate, decision-making, journalism, and scholarship. So there's one thing I most want to convey today. It's the fulfillment, the personal fulfillment that has come to me from a life as working as a journalist in and about China and now Taiwan. Not because the topics have always been happy or fun. They certainly haven't been, as you're about to discover. But reporting on China has allowed journalists like me, and I think some of you as researchers in other fields, however briefly and superficially, to have contact with people who've lived through extraordinary change, facing choices and hardship that someone of my background would never have encountered in the normal run of my life. And to carry along the conversation, I have some slides. So that's the younger me. Encounters like this, which is in Henan province in central China, this must be about 12 years ago now, a group of villagers who I'd come across in working on a story. As you can see, very concerned and very hopeful of talking to a journalist. I can explain more of what happened there later on. Of course, being a journalist has also given me a spectator's seat in the far back rows to one of the biggest stories of the 21st century, the rise of China. And I know many of you are China experts, but let me just touch briefly on some of those great themes that we cover. The extraordinary economic growth and contradictions of China, brazen commercialism under a communist party that still nominally honors Marx, tens of millions of rural people moving into towns and cities, struggling for work, housing, and I think very important to say, a measure of dignity as well. This is a scene from late 2017 in Beijing when hundreds of thousands of migrant workers were told virtually overnight that they had to leave the city. As Will also mentioned as well, COVID, if you can remember those few years, was a big theme. My last few years in China as well were dominated by the deepening repressive measures against Uyghurs, Tibetans, and other ethnic groups. The title of my talk comes from an encounter with a police officer who stopped us in Xinjiang, tried to stop us reporting, and when we asked why, he said, "There is no why here." Of course, what he meant was shut up and stop asking questions, but that always stuck with me as a kind of distillation of the roadblock that you can face in trying to understand and report on China. Of course, above all, there's been this man. A lot of my reporting over the past 12 years was about the rise and policies of Xi Jinping, China's present-day leader. I remember attending a meeting in Beijing a day or so after Xi Jinping became Party General Secretary in 2012, and it was a smoke-filled basement, heavy with cigarette smoke. And it was the sons and daughters of former officials and revolutionaries who were holding a seminar about their hopes and expectations for the Xi Jinping years. Many of them urged Xi Jinping to restart economic liberalization and to grasp the nettle of political liberalization. Back then, even many well-connected people in Beijing, not all, but many of them, thought that Xi Jinping would be a pragmatist focused on economic growth above all. Tougher than his predecessor, Hu Jintao, to be sure, but not a transformative figure. Well, what we've seen instead is Mr. Xi Jinping, who's made a priority of political security and ideological revival of the Communist Party. A leader who sees himself as presiding over historic transformation of China's place in the world. So how do we make sense of all these changes and where they're leading? How much of it is Xi Jinping the individual or the greater forces that will outlast him? I think that political science, economics, sociology, all of these disciplines have something to contribute. I think whatever approach we take, and this is getting into the main theme of my comments here, it very much helps to be attuned to the influences of China's past in the present day, and how much that history is alive in contemporary times and contemporary issues. That's one reason I hope that others will feel encouraged, even in difficult and discouraging times, to take that plunge into a closer experience of countries like China. Looking back, one thing that threaded through a good part of my reporting is how history is always there, part of people's personal journeys. Those farmers that you saw in the first picture were being moved to make way for a dam. They'd been waiting for that dam to be built since the late 1950s, moved again and again, some of them undergoing terrible suffering over the years. And contestation over history also courses through many of the great issues that put China in the news. The South China Sea, Tibet and Xinjiang, China's relationship with the United States and the West, and as we've seen even in the past few days, tensions over Taiwan and a fundamental contestation over the identity and status of Taiwan. But to show you what I mean in more detail, let me take you back here, back to Henan province. I must say, one of my favorite parts of China. I always tried to visit there once a year when I was a journalist. Not the most beautiful part of China in many ways, but a place rich with wonderful stories and wonderful people. So I went one year to Xinjiang, which is a very rural part of Henan. It has a dramatic past. It was a base of the Communist Revolution in the 1930s. Most notoriously, during the Great Leap Forward famine of China's 1950s, Xinjiang was among the worst hit of the worst hit areas. So the Great Leap Forward famine was the famine that followed Mao Zedong's effort to propel China into communist abundance and utopia, taking enormous amounts of grain from peasants who were left with none for themselves. By some estimates, up to 1 million peasants died in Xinjiang from the famine, many from starvation and related illnesses, and others were beaten to death. I went there in 2019 for the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. I was curious to find out what people who had lived through so much made of those memories in their country as it is today. I went with a colleague to walk through the countryside, talking to villagers about what they remembered and what those memories meant to them now. And in Xinjiang, many of the farmers are in their 60s and 70s, like this couple. Nearly all of the young people have moved to towns and cities now, so farming villages are largely people 50s, 60s, and 70s. Now, that was back when China was a little more relaxed, and I generally found in China, despite all of the talk of restrictions from officials generally didn't like to go into the villages and countryside. They much preferred to stay in the towns and the cities. So if you could hop on a train or a car and slip below them, you could often spend days reporting quite freely, and I always found that one of the most satisfying experiences of working in China. I also often found that when you approached people in villages and showed that you were genuinely interested in their lives, they were very friendly and opening, very welcoming often about answering questions and bringing you into their home and inviting for meals. Their large dogs on chains were sometimes less welcoming, so you got used to looking out for the dogs as well. I remember in particular on this one trip, I was walking down a dirt road with a colleague, and this elderly woman starts chasing after us, saying, "Are you a journalist? Are you a journalist?" And I thought, oh no, she's going to go and tell the village Communist Party secretary that there are foreign journalists around. And so I stopped and I said, "Yes, I am a journalist, but we won't be staying around long." And she said, "Look at this road here. The county government said they'd put asphalt on this road 10 years ago and nothing has changed. Can you go and tell the party general secretary of the county he has to fix this road now?" I forget what my answer was, but I thought it was charming that she thought I was going to help her fix a road and not tell the party secretary to go and get the police. On that trip, we also spoke to many elderly villagers like this lady, many of them who had memories of family members who died in the famine, brothers and sisters who perished, a father who died after eating grass and bark to try to stave off the terrible hunger. Now, that kind of reporting is, when I talk about the privilege of being a journalist in China, it's people who lived through experiences like that. And it sometimes felt intrusive to ask those questions. You could feel that people were summoning up painful memories that they hadn't dwelled on for many years. Perhaps they'd shared those memories with their families, but very rarely beyond, and never in public commemoration. But I've also found over the years that wherever there are sites of painful history in China, momentous history, there always seem to be people, amateur historians, journalists, retired officials, who try to recover and preserve the memories of what happened, no matter what the official line is. In Xinjiang, one of them was this man, Wu Yongquan, a retired village accountant. He'd built a memorial to honor his father who died in the famine. Helped by his son, Wu Yongquan created those two stones, these etched stones that you see here, etched with the names of 72 people who starved to death in this village. So he was one man who felt that there was something worth memorizing here and worried about those memories being lost. He said, in another 20 years, it may be that nobody in the village will know what happened in 1959. But visiting villages, homes in Xinjiang, something else stood out. Many of them had pictures in their front rooms like this. Of course, Mao Zedong, China's revolutionary leader. Sometimes I'll have pictures of Xi Jinping and pop stars, but most often it would be Mao Zedong. And over my years of visiting Henan and other provinces, I would often have these conversations with farmers asking, why is Chairman Mao's picture up in your room when your family suffered so much? And a lot of them still had this genuine reverence for Mao that survived everything that they went through. And Wu Yongquan himself, who built that memorial, said it wasn't his fault. It wasn't Chairman Mao's fault. The central leaders didn't know what was happening in Xinjiang. And I'm not sure that was true, but he seemed convinced that that was the fact. Now, maybe they were saying some of this out of nervous politeness in the presence of a foreign journalist. There may be something to that, but it's something I heard repeatedly over the years. A reverence to Mao that I think somehow also extends and continues to extend to some extent to the party now and to Xi Jinping. So what do we make of this story? One of the points that stands out to me is how the Communist Party has been able to extend and exercise its power by shaping public memory, by dominating the stories that Chinese people tell themselves about where they and their country have come from and where it's headed. So I was struck that even this part of the Chinese countryside, where peasants endured the greatest suffering during the Great Leap Famine, so many of them still embraced in some ways the party's version of the past. And I think that means that people tend to embrace more of the party's story of China's present and the future as well. I think Xi Jinping in particular understands that. During his era, the Chinese Communist Party has been redoubling control over the Chinese Communist Party, over the economy, over China's claimed territories. But I think parallel to that, what particularly interests me is how Xi and the party have also been reasserting control over history and memory, closing publications that question the official version of history, but also resurrecting the party's own accounts of its past in television dramas, new museums, all of the public displays that you'll see in many parts of China now. That desire to control the past, to defend the party's mythology, goes beyond Xi Jinping. He didn't start it, but I think it's been a focus of his time in power. Starting from the very time that he came to power, you might remember he made these comments about lessons from the fall of the Soviet Union. In a very famous document in 2013, now called Document Number 9, Xi named the creeds that he considered ideological enemies of the party: civil society, constitutionalism, freedom of the press, and also what is called historical nihilism, denying the party's achievements. And that document says, by rejecting the history of the Chinese Communist Party, in the history of the new China, historical nihilism seeks to fundamentally undermine the Communist Party's mission. So you can see this sense that control of the past is so important to controlling the present in China. Under this drive, sensitive sites like this haunting cemetery to Red Guards who were killed in armed fighting in Chongqing have been closed to the public. Ancient religious shrines in Xinjiang have been bulldozed out of existence. Xi Jinping has also made his own life story part of the official narrative. This is from a village to Liangjiahe. This is the village in Shanxi province where Xi Jinping was sent down during the Cultural Revolution. When I first went there, it was a fairly relaxed place, but over the years you could see it being built into this pilgrimage site where groups of Chinese officials and students would be taken to learn about Xi Jinping's story, this story of suffering and resurrection in the Cultural Revolution that is part of his official narrative. I think perhaps part of what is going on here is a kind of generational anxiety. Xi sees him is the son of a revolutionary, and his generation of leaders, I think, are particularly worried that as the party leaves further and further from its revolutionary origins, it risks becoming unmoored from its past. So the party needs to constantly reinforce this theme that its founding stories remain the source of authority and power in China. Now, in the past few years in China, something else interesting has been happening with history. Xi Jinping also shows a striking interest about how to retell the history of China's ancient past, not just the past century, but the past 3,000 years, the past 5,000 years. There have been many official efforts to shape discussion of how history, reaching back thousands of years, shows an unbroken Chinese nationhood and unbroken values that remain alive in China today. By my rough count, the Politburo, that's the Central Council of the Chinese Communist Party, has held study sessions on aspects of Chinese ancient history about 7 or 8 times since 2012. So if you could imagine a US president drawing together his cabinet of department heads to study the origins of civilization or the latest findings of archaeology, that's essentially what Xi Jinping is doing. He sees immense value and significance even in the ancient past. He said last year in a speech about this, only if we base ourselves on the magnificent history of the Chinese civilization over 5,000 years can one really understand the historical inevitability, cultural meaning, and unique superiority of China's path. So why is it that the leader of the second biggest economy in the world would be so interested in curating how China's ancient past is told? I think part of this is the shifting master narratives that rival governments in the world are using to tell the story about where the world is headed in the future. Once upon a time, some kind of revolutionary Marxism offered the Chinese Communist Party its master story about its place in the world. Later, it seemed for a while that economic modernization would be China's master story, this vague idea that economic growth on its own would make China a respected and powerful member of the great powers. But especially under Xi Jinping in the past decade, neither of those stories seems to fit official needs anymore. Instead, Xi and other leaders are reviving these narratives of civilizational greatness and destiny, celebrated in this spectacle like this confected ritual to the Yellow Emperor, which was in Zhejiang province, which has no real connection to the Yellow Emperor. As an aside, I should mention, I think that perhaps as Xi was coming to power, preparing for power before 2012, he was keeping a close eye on what Vladimir Putin was doing in Russia. And so you can see certain parallels between how the two leaders are using history for their ends. Now, none of this means that Chinese people unquestioningly absorb these official narratives of history. One of the stories I did is about this trend in China for hanfu, for people who wear clothing which is supposedly dated to prior to the Qing dynasty. So to show your pure Han identity, these are the clothes that you would wear. Now, some of them are fervent nationalists, but I also found a lot of them had very thoughtful views about their national identity and why they would want to identify themselves as being a Han ethnic group. And it was actually a more thoughtful conversation than you might expect. There are also groups and individuals who challenge the official narrative, sometimes at great risk. For me, one of the most memorable experiences of working in China in those last years was getting to know this woman here, Zhang Lin. She was a retired journalist for the Liberation Army Daily, the official newspapers of China's military. And she had a very quiet and very comfortable life in Beijing, which she could have kept enjoying, but she was very close to Tiananmen Square on June 4, 1989. And she'd also been a witness to the prior crackdown in Lhasa in Tibet, which people sometimes forget. And she'd seen all the bloodshed in those two events. And although she was part of the system, over that years, this sense that she wanted to talk about it, that she had something to unbear, gnawed at her. And so I got to know her in 2019 and had this fascinating experience of working through her memories, working which ones were true, working through her feelings about this event. And she said, the pain has eaten at me for 30 years, she said. Everyone who took part must speak up about what they know happened. That's our duty to the dead, the survivors, and the children of the future. So I thought it's always salutary, even when we talk about the controls in China, about Xi Jinping's dominance. You have these voices, these people who can come out of nowhere who want to say, no, I disagree. So finally, my story, there she is there. She's in Canada now, I believe. So finally, my story brings me to Taiwan, where I've been living and working for almost 2 years. And once again, I'm learning about the importance of history and memory. As we've been learning in the past few days with renewed PLA exercises around Taiwan, the divisions between Beijing and Taiwan are a territorial dispute, but they're founded in vastly different understandings of Taiwan's history and identity. The political divisions within Taiwan as well are also founded on rival views of Taiwan's historical status. Is it a separate country? Is it a survival of the Republic of China from 1949? Is it a part of Chinese civilization or something distinct which is emerging? When I was in China, I'd long reported on Taiwan as a sort of geopolitical puzzle, this piece of Lego that was being moved around by Beijing or the United States. But when you spend time in Taiwan, you realize how complex those issues are and how much they're tied to domestic dynamics in Taiwan and memories in Taiwan as well. So let me end with this lovely image from a reporting trip just a couple of weeks ago. This is in southern Taiwan, a ritual that happens every 3 years where the locals in this town called Donggang build this carved wooden boat to the local deity called Wang Ye. And every 3 years they build it and show it around town, pray before it, and then this ritual that happened at 5 a.m. in the morning took it to the local beach and then burned it to the ground. You know, something else that brings to me this importance of understanding tradition in the lives of people and understanding that societies like Taiwan aren't simply these secular replicas of the United States, but very distinct places in the world. So I started out by voicing my hope that some, perhaps a student here or there, will feel encouraged to study China and other parts of the world, to learn about politics and economics, to be sure, but also to be aware about the history and culture of these places. Now, doing that is going to require more than a pep talk from me today. And I know that the Shorenstein Center is very devoted, like Stanford, to encouraging study of China, study of Asia, and that's great to see. I'm also pleased the New York Times has the resources still, thank God, to keep up the effort of reporting on China. But I think when we look forward to the great challenges we face in understanding and working with China, dealing with China, it's going to take a much larger effort as well, not just a Stanford or a New York Times, but a greater long-term effort to encourage younger people especially to take that adventure that I was able to take of learning about China, another seemingly unwelcoming part of the world, and making it part of their lives. So I'm very grateful for the award today and looking forward to the questions that will now come from you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. And what we're going to do now is we're going to have a discussion amongst ourselves, and then we are going to open it up to questions from all of you. But before we do that, I just want to introduce the other two folks who just joined us on the stage. We're very fortunate, as was mentioned, to be joined by two distinctive scholars of China here at Stanford. First, Oriana Skylar Mastro and Xueguang Zhou. to my left. Oriana is a Center Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and Courtesy Assistant Professor of Political Science at Stanford, where she focuses on Chinese military and security policy. She's a non-resident scholar of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and she's also the author of Upstart, How China Became a Great Power. And then, further to my left, Xueguang is the Kwoh-Ting Li Professor of Economic Development, a Professor of Sociology, and a Senior Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute. He is an expert on China's bureaucratic state, and he studies institutional changes in contemporary Chinese society, focusing in particular on Chinese organizations, social inequality, and state-society relations. So what we're going to do is, Chris, you're not off the hook at all. There's a great deal of interest in your reporting, but we're going to widen that discussion amongst us. But I think we need to begin with your reporting and with you, Chris. And so the most obvious question right off the bat, and something that you alluded to in your talk, is you are the chief China correspondent for the New York Times, based in Taiwan. And so I think it's of great interest to people to hear how you do that. How do you tell China's story from afar?
Oh, goodness. With a great deal of humbleness, I do think there's a loss from not being in China. One of the things I always thought you gained from being able to travel around China to work and do research in China is just that fingertip sense about what people are talking about, what people care about, what public sentiment is. And of course, a great deal of gossip and rumor as well. So, I don't think there's any disguising that there is a loss to our understanding of China when journalists can't go there to report and when there's less scholarship and research on the ground as well. So how does one do it? First of all, starting off from that recognition that, for example, there's certain stories that I don't like to do about China now because I feel ill-qualified. At the same time, the New York Times does have 2 journalists still in China. We work as a team on a lot of stories, and I think it's a matter of staying in constant dialogue with our colleagues there, using whatever contacts you have in China, trying to keep up with the torrent of commentary on Chinese social media. For me in particular, trying to understand Chinese politics, it's back to basics as well, like paying close attention to what is appearing in official media, laboriously working through Xi Jinping's speeches and other leaders as well. It's tea leaf reading in some ways. But even in Beijing back in the day, reporting conditions were getting tighter and tighter. And even before I was forced to leave China, the number of people you could talk to in Beijing who were well informed about elite politics was shrinking quickly. So I know it's not ideal. I'm going to New York after this, and I might ask them about retiring that title of Chief China Correspondent and thinking of something else. But that's what we have to do now. And it's not just in China. We're facing similar challenges with Russia, Iran, and other important countries as well.
I know that in a heartbeat you would change circumstances and you would be back on mainland China if you could. But even what you're just saying just now, is there any hints of something that makes it a little bit easier from this distance? Is there anything that you look at it and you say, well, actually, some of these conversations are easier to be had, or just full stop no?
Well, I'm in Taiwan now, which is a very special relationship with China. I'm learning much more about that cross-strait relationship and its complexities, and the complexities on both sides and how these great geopolitical issues are really also rooted in the domestic dynamics of both Taiwan and China. So that's been very enlightening to me. And so being outside does give you a certain perspective. It makes you be more resourceful about how you do reporting. But I do think in the end we need to get more journalists back in China. And that's not just for the New York Times, I just mean in general. Right. It would be a negative for the world if it just keeps on as it is.
Right. Well, let's get to that special relationship across the strait. As you mentioned in your talk, just in the last couple days, we've seen this increased military activity off the coast of Taiwan. And so, Oriana, I wanted to go to you on just, can you give everyone here sort of a sense of what you see as the logic of, we know the longstanding relationship, but the logic of this moment and this activity now and what you see there?
Sure. So to what Chris was saying, let me just piggyback off of the discussion of the difficulties of understanding China from afar. I have it, I think, a little bit easier than Chris in that I still go to China and still can go to China. But even then, most academics are not going, right? It is now illegal to do what I do, going and asking about national security issues. They passed a law a couple years ago, and we do know they have taken some scholars and have accused them of spies and detained them from running around and asking, like, oh, what would you do if Taiwan did this? And what are your, I'm very direct. I'm always like, what are your invasion plans for Taiwan? Like, let's talk about it. Yeah, I make sure the PLA generals have a few glasses of wine before I ask them, but I still ask them, how do you feel about your readiness? Like, how's it going? But it is a big problem, and people are concerned. I have to tell you, the last time I was in China, the party hosted me, and the more that they were like, you see, nothing bad happened to you. Like, tell all your friends. And the more that they kept on telling me how brave I was to be there, the more I was thinking, oh, maybe I shouldn't be here at all. But to understand, Chris is absolutely right. There is an intuition there. And my initial work on Taiwan stemmed from that intuition. I was just in Beijing when my Chinese colleagues were like, over lunch, like, I think it's time for armed reunification for Taiwan. Like, what do you think? And I was like, what? Like, what are we talking about? And so going back to that conversation, that's when I started first looking at the changing dynamics of China's policy behavior and capabilities vis-a-vis Taiwan. And to answer your question directly, to me, it's very clear what the Chinese are doing. So a couple, I think now a year or two ago, I was meeting with some PLA leaders, and they were telling me about peace reunification. So this is a long-standing Chinese policy that used to be that the Chinese were trying to stay closer social, cultural, economic ties with the island of Taiwan to convince the people of Taiwan to want to be a part of China. So they're talking to me about peace reunification, and I was like, I'm just going to stop you right there. It's not working. I know it's not working. On a good day, maybe, I see Karis here, maybe he can correct me, 4 to 7% of the people of Taiwan are like, I want to be a part of, China. So I said, why do you keep saying this? And they said, Mei Huilin, you never understand anything. So the thing is, it's not peace reunification. Now it's changed. It's called peace reunification backed by significant military force. And the strategy is still peace reunification. It's just to increase the military intimidation to the point that the government and people of Taiwan realize that it's hopeless. And so that they do peacefully capitulate to unify with mainland China. So the increase in military activity around Taiwan, generally speaking, is a part of that strategy. It's also a part of readiness because, and I give hours of lectures on this. I don't have hours right now, but I'll just say in the past 25 years, China modernized their equipment, built the number of equipment, reorganized their whole military, and now the last step is making sure all those components go together. They have to practice. That's why the DoD often doesn't call them exercises. If you read in the news, we like to call them rehearsals to really hammer home, like, this isn't just a signal. So part of it is, yes, signaling to Taiwan, listen, no one can help you here. Part of it is a rehearsal. So in these exercises in particular, they're much denser than they had been before. For an island invasion, it's not just the case that they, are going to send over ships and missiles and aircraft, but these things actually have to work very intricately together. And this is the last stage of their modernization that they're waiting for. So someone asked me the other day, like, was this planned? I mean, the Chinese knew that President Lai was going to say something they weren't going to like, So in that respect, it was kind of planned. The question then is, like, what is the most useful way of using that opportunity to achieve some of these other goals?
Right. Xueguang, would you like to jump in here?
When I look at China as a sociologist, I've been studying China for a long time. But whenever I read a report by Chris and other foreign journalists, you always something very refreshing because of different perspectives, different views of looking at the things. I think this is what makes a huge difference, that you have different views on China. Because over the years, as I studied China, and you realize China has really become much more diverse. There are so many different voices. I mean, I think the polarization in Chinese society probably is the largest in this country, but of course, on different topics. So that's why you really need different views on looking at China and observing what kind of different voices. Looking at from a distance, looking at China, I was observing and listening to different discussions about China. It tends to use one model, either a totalitarianism or authoritarianism, or on the way to democracy or open society. China may be an element of all these models, but it's really becomes so diverse. I mean, this is what I think reflected in Chris' talk about the varieties. For example, Xinjiang, the episode you talked about, I actually read several books on Xinjiang and their experience in the Great Leap Forward episode, because that's one region hit so hard. There are really millions died in that region and beyond. But you presented people who talk about still worship Mao, that historical legacies. But I also read other places, people really are very critical of Mao and Mao's disastrous policies onto the Chinese people in that period of time. So I think this is where, when we look at China, what I found is you really need people like Chris, like the foreign correspondents, being there on the ground and really conduct closing observations and report to us, what's going on in Chinese society. And that's one thing I think somehow is missing in this discussion about China and discussion about China and relationship with the rest of the world. Yeah, I think that's my main take from the conversations about China nowadays.
Mm-hmm. One of the dominant factors that's shifting, and it goes across everything we've just discussed, is this man you put up on the screen at one point, Xi Jinping, and the rise of a more, I would say, personalist style of power, centralization of power in these last dozen years or so. And you've written a lot about it, and it certainly shapes the shifting Taiwan policy and the diversity in the state-society relations that you speak of, Shorenstein. You said that in your talk that people misjudged and saw him as perhaps being a pragmatic. When space has shrunk, but still, when you talk to people now, where do they see this going? How do they feel about the man that he's proven himself to be at this point?
Yes, I've got an ambivalent relationship with Xi Jinping. He's made my life difficult in some ways, but he's also provided a lot of copy for me. So there is that going for him. And trying to make sense of China under Xi Jinping, and Xi Jinping himself has been like part of my daily work for some time. I guess I'm trying to think of the one word that would describe sentiment in China now about where Xi Jinping is taking the country. I'm not sure what word you two would suggest. I've been talking to friends there, and I think a lot of people are feeling daunted by where the country is headed. And some of them feeling worried. In particular, I think one of the things that I find very difficult to understand now is we've seen China enter a period of significantly slower growth. We've seen an accumulation of economic problems, particularly in the property sector that the government is trying to deal with. But Oriana may have something to say about this as well. My sense is from people coming back from Beijing and talking to officials, it seems the Chinese leadership still seems very confident that Xi Jinping's phrase, the East is on the rise and the West is on decline, is still widely accepted as the official doctrine. In other words, this view that the Western powers, and the United States in particular, are in relative decline, and despite China's economic problems, it's on the rise, that remains very much a part of official thinking, I think, even now after 2 years of serious trouble in the economy. So I think a lot of people, including myself, are really trying to figure out that disjunction between official ambition now and where those growth indicators are showing where China may be in the next 10 years. And within China as well, I think, you know, as I said, I try to be humble about making judgments about the public mood there, but it does seem, particularly within the middle class in cities, who were doing quite well for a long time there, there's now this undercurrent, or even a louder current of anxiety about the direction of China. And you even hear about, and I hear about it from friends indirectly as well, officials who feel frustrated about the direction of the country. But the great mystery to me is whether and how these undercurrents of discontent, of dissension can coalesce into something that would amount to a serious challenge to Xi Jinping's power and policies. I don't see it yet, but I'd be very interested in what Oriana and Xueguang have to say about that.
No, I think from the military perspective, it's a bit different, the view of Xi Jinping. I'm not an economist, I'm not a sociologist, so it's hard for me to assess the impact on society that you know, Chris is mentioning overall. And I have heard that there's a lot of you know, unhappiness about the direction of the economy. But Xi Jinping's policies have been very good for the military. And whatever we can say about, and much needs to be said about restriction of freedoms in China, the military is a much more professional fighting force today than it was 10 years ago. I mean, he did what Putin probably should have done before he invaded Ukraine, and he reviewed the military forces, and he was like, you guys have all this fancy stuff right now, but I don't think you can do anything with it, and really instituted a program, more realistic exercises of reporting up failures and weaknesses and vulnerabilities. He was like, I don't want to hear that everything is good. And within military ranks, and I guess maybe some of the more hawkish voices that I interact with in China, I think there is happiness of like Xi Jinping kind of standing up for China in some ways. Like that Hu Jintao, you know, this whole like standing up to foreigners, like in the first meeting with the Biden administration when they said, you know, United States, you're no longer in a position of strength to tell us what to do. I think there are some elements of that, and Xi Jinping has been trying to ride on that for his legitimacy. The question is whether that sort of happiness of playing a greater role on the world stage and or not letting foreigners push them around, making progress towards some of these territorial goals that they have, like in the South China Sea and Taiwan, and having a stronger military is going to be able to, you know, outbalance a lot of the problems that Chris laid out. I think probably not, but just to point out, at least if everything else is falling apart in China, like the military definitely isn't at this point.
And just on that point, the anti-corruption drive in the military, cleaning house did leave a lot of people in the military more happy.
Yeah.
People were fed up with having to pay for promotions, and I think that's another aspect more broadly within China that over the past 10 years, I do think, you know, has corruption disappeared in China? No, but compared to the brazen corruption that was obvious in the last years of Hu Jintao's years, including in the military, that was a big political gain for Xi Jinping that still, I think, counts to his political favor in China.
I think after the long years of pandemic, and also the economy now really in serious trouble. I mean, I went back to China a few times after the pandemic, and you can hear all the concerns, deep worries about the future of China. I think that's probably cross-board, different social groups. They still have different voices, different opinions about where China should go, what directions it should go. But the concerns, the worries are really deep, running deep. I think that's across all different groups. If you follow the social media in China and you listen, even though, I mean, under a lot of political pressures, you don't see a lot of open voices, but you see a lot of undercurrents where really what in sociological terms called everyday resistance, kind of views, voices try to really express their discontent about the current situations and among different issues. So most of the time you see the internet very smooth, very quiet, but just upon some events, and you have a volcano disrupted, and suddenly a lot of opinions just expressed in a few hours, then of course get censored right away. Right. So yeah, I think China has changed a great deal, even, it's ongoing changes. It's ongoing changes in responding to the kind of political landscape, the political pressures, but also the deteriorating problems in the economy. I think that's very, very serious issues. Wherever you talk to, you probably get pretty much the same response. It's pretty worrisome.
And so if we square this and we think about, well, this more muscular, centralized version of the Chinese state and under Xi, and as it even manifests itself in military policy in Taiwan, how do you see it from your new vantage in Taiwan? How does the Taiwanese public viewing this? Are they inured to this at this point? Does the saber rattling sound different than before, or how does it sort of look across the lines of reporting you're doing there?
Yes, well, speaking of Taiwan, I think visitors to Taiwan are always struck by how relaxed Taiwan seems. I'm not in Taiwan for the current military exercises. Maybe they've ended at this point, but it was always striking that if you're a foreign journalist there writing about the latest PLX exercises around Taiwan, you'll sometimes get local people saying, well, why are you making such a big deal of this? No, we've become used to China's threats. It's been doing this for years. We're not too worried. And so I think that's still a strong current of opinion in Taiwan. At the same time, I do think it is registering in the Taiwanese public now, and certainly in the government, that, as Oriana was explaining, China's military capabilities are now notably different and notably more threatening than they were even just 10 years ago. And that's beginning to feed through policy making and more urgent efforts to build up Taiwan's military. But I sense on the part of policymakers there, it's a difficult balance as well. They want to build up Taiwan's defenses. They want a sense of urgency. But if they move too far on that, they risk panicking the public and discouraging investment. And so, again, there I think you can see how the domestic dynamic in Taiwan, the considerations that weigh on policymakers mean that while Washington and other capitals may be asking that Taiwan spends 5% every year of GDP on defense, builds up much more rapidly its weaponry. The balance that Taiwan is trying to strike at the moment is also reflects their concerns about maintaining economic growth and not panicking the public as well. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Taiwanese stock market really hasn't reflected any alarm over the past couple of days. At the same time, when I think about it as a journalist, I'm not so concerned about the military threat to Taiwan in, say, 6 months' time or 12 months' time. But I think about the changing world, the changing balance of power in Asia, and I think 8 or 10 years' time, we could see a fundamentally different world. And that doesn't mean that war on Taiwan is inevitable or imminent, but I just think it makes maintaining the peace even more difficult than it is now.
What do you think of that timeline, Oriana?
Oh man, if we still have 8 years, that's an optimistic
That's
timeline.
rosy.
That's rosy. I mean, I like to say war over Taiwan is inevitable, but we can delay it forever. And what I mean by that is I don't have any ideas about how to resolve the problem. There is no future in which I don't see, a high likelihood of a possible war over Taiwan, like given just what I currently know. But I know that certain policies by the United States, allies, partners, and Taiwan will make it so it's not a possibility right now. And I think at this point it really is a war of choice for China. It's not a war of necessity yet. So as long as the costs and likelihood of victory do not look good, we'll be safe. The problem is that balance of power, by the time the PLA is ready in 2027, I'm not sure that the map looks like what I would like it to look like to convince the Chinese of that. And so I think we're in a much better position 10 to 15 years from now. There's certain investments the United States is making in defense that maybe puts us in a better position 10 to 15 years from now. So if we can get there, then we're going to be in a safer place.
But everyone knows that.
But everybody knows that. The Chinese are kind of moving as fast as they can. I mean, this goes to what Chris was saying about reporting. I have found, and also with my job of sort of writing more public stuff, I think everyone has a sense that there's a sense of urgency, But, and this isn't, this is more maybe a critique for people like me than you, Chris. I don't mean this as a critique, but it doesn't seem to me that people really understand fundamentally why. Like, what is different? I get this question all the time. Like you were saying, people in Taiwan being like, oh, well, this happens all the time. So I think everyone has this sense that something significant, okay, everyone's panicking about it, but then they're like, are you guys just kind of making this up? So I don't think we've done a good enough job. Or maybe I should at least leave it to, I don't think I've done a good enough job, or people in my position, to explain what is so different today in 2024 than even in 2014. To give people a sense that it's not just what about Xi Jinping and what he says, it's also about the behavior, it's also about the capabilities that's making us very concerned.
Well, there's much more to talk about on this, but perhaps we'll get to it in the Q&A. There's something we haven't mentioned yet, which is history. And history undergirds, it was quite meaningful to me that, and I feel as I was a Chinese history major myself in school, that your study of Communist Party history, I feel like I see it in your work, that I see a real understanding of thinking and paradigms and history and the role that it remains present even now. How have you seen that? I want to tie this to the breadth of your time in China. How have you seen that change? How has it become more evident? I think of Ian Johnson's book Sparks, which did a wonderful job of showing the intertwining of history with present-day struggle. Was it always there? Do you see this as a rare constant in your time in China as a reporter, or did it change like so much else?
I think it did change, and it's a little difficult for me to sort of characterize that change, but I should explain that having learned a little Chinese, I went to study Communist Party history at People's University, Renmin Dashi, as it was then called, and one of the few Chinese universities that did have a Communist Party history department. And I remember in one of my classes was on scientific socialism, and I tried to take my classes seriously. I'd be writing my notes industriously, and I sort of put my head up one day and I looked around the classroom of about 20 students, and every student had their head on their desk sleeping. So that was back in 1990. So I think what has changed now is if you went into a classroom in China now, I'm not saying you wouldn't see any heads on the desk sleeping, but I think particularly under Xi Jinping, there's a sense that history is at stake again. And I think in particular because he sees himself as a transformative leader who wants to define and redefine China's path in the world. You've seen all of these contests about history come into play again. And as you say, it's Ian Johnson's book wonderfully delves into that. And so as the party has tried to redefine how the public should understand that history, it's become more contested, more censored, but it's also become more important to understanding the present as well. And that's at multiple levels. I think, Ian Johnson explores that at the public level. We've seen Xi Jinping, for example, 2021 brings in a new resolution about the history of China and the Communist Party, which gives a very Xi Jinping-centric view of China's development up to now and then its future as well. So I think both at the official level and the public level, history has seemed at stake in a way that didn't seem to be the case, say, in the years of Hu Jintao and even Jiang Zemin.
There's always two versions of Chinese history, how that affects the current Communist Party and the revolutionary legacies. The one, of course, is the official version nowadays, trying to impose upon the educational systems, institutions. But also there are really scholars who are working very hard trying to dig out the kind of historical issues about Communist Party histories in Jinggangshan, and how there's a very good book called How the Party is Forged, how the party organization is forged during that period of time. And really, it just revealed a lot of the real cruel struggle within the party that formed so-called Leninist characteristics of the Communist Party in that period. I think that all these things and many other historical research is trying to reveal the key characteristics of the Communist Party today. It partly comes from the historical, what I studied, the Chinese bureaucracy, but also the other one is imported from the Leninist party state. So how these combine to form the kind of capacities we have observed today. So I think this is more, I would say, academic, scholarly research, somewhat separate or distinctive from the party lines of the official version of it.
Yes, just to build on what Xueguang was saying, then I think that's the other interesting thing about the Chinese leadership's relationship to history. It's also a toolbox for them. Like I certainly think in the view of Xi Jinping and other leaders, they believe that Mao Zedong and other leaders developed a toolbox of techniques for running China and running the party. Right. And that's self-criticism, investigation teams. It's all of these techniques of using power. And the reason to defend the legitimacy of the Maoist revolution and Mao is because those techniques still have a place in China. So I think it's that toolbox of history that's important to them as well.
I want to now give people here the opportunity to ask Chris or any of the panelists a question. So if you would, we have microphones right there in the aisle, and you can come up. I would just ask that we're very short on time, so I'd ask that you ask a very specific and brief question, and then that will give Chris and the others a chance to give you a full reply. So we'll start with you, sir.
So I know that there is no why, but I'm still going to ask why. Why is it that since the founding of the People Republic of China, China has cared about Taiwan so much? You know, when you think of it, it's a relatively small island, only 23 million inhabitants. On the scale of China, it barely registers, so it defies logic to risk a war, economic disaster. Clearly, China doesn't need Taiwan. So what's your view on why they care so much?
I'll hazard half of an answer, and I'll leave some of it to Oriana in particular. I think part of the answer, and I think this is something that comes from spending time in China, is understanding how visceral and emotional the issue of Taiwan has become for, I think, the Chinese leadership, but also many members of the Chinese public as well. This belief that Taiwan and Taiwan's separation from the mainland is a remnant, an unresolved remnant of the civil war of the 1940s. And so, although I think you can construct all sorts of rationales for why Taiwan is important, military, economic, semiconductors, strategic about its position in the Pacific, I think fundamentally for the leadership, it's also part of what is the Chinese leadership, particularly Xi Jinping's sense of restoring Chinese nationhood to its full status in the world. And to do that, Taiwan has to be brought back to the motherland. I think that sense of history and that very emotional sense about Taiwan's status within Chinese history is important from their point of view. Now, there are probably other reasons as well, but I think that very emotional sense about why Taiwan matters is important in understanding why it's so often in the news now.
I think, strategically, territory has always mattered to countries. It helps them build and exercise power, which means that they have more strategic space to do what they want to do, compel other countries to accommodate their preferences. I think, at least for me, when I talk to students about it, it's helpful to think about it kind of on a personal level. There's this emotional component to this that, I think spite is generally an understudied thing in international relations, but if you've ever been an underdog and you've had someone more powerful than you and they just, in your feeling, in your mind, they just abuse it and they abuse it. Like, that's where I think China is with a lot of this. And Taiwan is just like the perfect example of how the United States has been poking them in the eye, for 6 decades.
I think one of the major inventions in the 20th century is nationalism. I think that probably explains a lot about to your question.
Yes, next question.
Yes, I would like to know your opinion about China's action toward Taiwan in response to if Harris win or Trump win.
We talk a bit about how long it would take for an election question to come up, so it wasn't the first one. So how would China respond to a Trump or a Harris victory?
Yeah.
With respect to Taiwan, and how would Taiwan respond to that as well? I think if it's a Harris victory, I think they're going to assume it's going to be broadly policy continuity. If it's a Trump victory, then as with many things, there's much more uncertainty about where policy goes. And I think particularly with Taiwan and China policy and security policy in general, in that there are so many aspects of a Trump presidency that remain uncertain. He does have that transactional side to him. We saw in that interview that he gave to Business Week, I think it was, a few months ago, complaining that Taiwan should pay more for its defense services from the United States, for example. There's that transactional side, but we've also seen around Trump, there's also voices which are much harder on China as well. So I think, I know I could speak more directly about Taiwan. I think there's a lot of uncertainty about where a Trump administration would go because we don't know who the key policymakers would be within a Trump administration. Within China, I'm not so sure, Oriana and Xueguang. I think there may be some things they would like about a Trump administration, but I don't think the leadership has a great appetite for uncertainty in the world at the moment. And I think a Trump administration would mean to them much more uncertainty about where policy is headed.
So my own view is there's sort of good news and bad news about both for Taiwan from a U.S. policy perspective. President Harris is going to have more continuity. What that means very specifically in the military realm is that she's going to continue to strengthen relations with allies and partners in the region. This is important not just from sort of like hippy-dippy, we want people to like us and be legitimate international players. It's also important because the United States is not a resident power in Asia. We require access, basin, and overflight to project military power. And the more our allies and partners like us, the more they provide that access. And so what I was referring to before of kind of the United States needs to get certain things in position to be able to defend Taiwan, that's 100% reliant on whether other countries let us do things within their borders. And Trump really pisses them off. And when he does that, they're like, no, United States, no, you can't have this here. So it's possible, on one hand, from a Chinese perspective, they're kind of excited about this prospect of Trump kind of blowing everything up, which will make it harder for the United States to defend Taiwan, have legitimacy to do so. On the other hand, you know, to what Chris was saying, a lot of people are like, well, Trump doesn't care about Taiwan. But short of him, like, very clearly saying, like, I don't care, China, you can take it, which even then I think they'd be like, is this a trick? Like, short of that, I don't think his ambivalence about Taiwan really impacts Chinese thinking. I think they have to assume the United States is going to, like, try to do something. So I think because he's unpredictable, though, even if they feel ready, I don't think they're going to try to do anything with Taiwan with a President Trump into office. Now, let me just add a caveat. I'm not concerned about China starting a war when there's a President Trump. But I am concerned about a President Trump not understanding like all the different nuances and intricacies of the U.S. policy on Taiwan doing things that cause the war. The United States puts a military base on Taiwan, it's war. The United States extends a nuclear umbrella to Taiwan, it's war. Like, so based on some people who want to push the envelope, many people who are in his past administration who was like, Taiwan's independent, we might as well just admit it and go for it, or a lack of real knowledge about U.S. commitments to China under the communiques, I do get concerned that he could provoke a war. So there's good news and bad news about both candidates.
Yeah, I was struck by your reporting, Chris, on this question back after Trump's comments, that the voices, the people you spoke to in Taiwan, offered a very sober response to the possibility of Trump's return to the White House, and very much we're expressing it from the standpoint of, well, there would be there's a lot of misunderstanding here, and there's a lot that can be cleared up through education and talking to the new team.
Yes, just on this point about the presidential race and its implications, I think broadly in Taiwan, and I think in China as well, one of the most important decisions for the next president, whoever that may be, is going to be about Ukraine. And certainly in Taiwan, people are going to pay a lot of attention to the implications of how what happens in the war in Ukraine after the presidential election. You know, if it comes to peace terms for Ukraine, what are they like? There are people who say that they're two separate issues, but I just think in Taiwan, people are paying very close attention to Ukraine and its implications for American consistency in policy and commitment in the world.
We are just at time, so I want to take these last two questions. Let's take them both at the same time, and then Chris and the panel can answer them. So go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Chris. Another why question, which is not a straightforward, simple answer. That there's a lot to be unhappy about in China, but the Chinese public is basically quiescent. It's unpleasant, it's not intolerable. What are your thoughts, Chris, on this is because of faith in the future? They get through the couple of hard years and the wisdom of the course will be proven, effectiveness of intimidation and control, of faith in a cyclical version of history, that it's going to swing in the other direction and get better. But what are your thoughts?
Okay, and right here.
Mastro, you said that the relationship between Taiwan and China is like a relationship between two people getting divorced. But then if you also mentioned that America's like the picky boss here, so then why is America so obsessed with Taiwan? And is deterrence the only way to stop like a war there?
Okay, great. Do you want to start with the first question?
Well, I'll start with a very simple answer. I think to Tom Finger's question, I think you gave all of the answers that I would give, actually. I think it's probably a combination of all of those factors. My feeling is, sometimes you can read reports about China that would give the impression that the Chinese Communist Party relies entirely on coercion to remain in power. And coercion and control are very important, but I don't think that is the full explanation about why the Chinese Communist Party has remained such a robust political force in China for so long. It goes beyond that. But I do think particularly these days we are seeing growing discontent and unhappiness about the state of the economy, particularly post-COVID, a lot of uncertainty about the future. I'm sure Xueguang has something to say about this. But from what I can tell from a distance now, there's no sense of an alternative on the horizon. And as long as there's no sense of an alternative on the horizon to the Communist Party remaining in power in China, it's very difficult to think about how a substantive opposition could arise to the Communist Party. Now, that said, we've seen eruptions of protest in China that can come out of nowhere, even in this highly controlled environment. So I'm not saying this sense of no alternative remains forever, but I think certainly for now, the Chinese Communist Party, with all of its control and accumulated experience in government, still remains a formidable political force.
So let me just clarify that the viewpoint of the United States pointing like China and the eye on Taiwan, I was speaking from my understanding of how the Chinese see it. Obviously, from the American perspective, we could have a debate about a lot of things, but one thing is clear. The United States would prefer the status quo, right? If things stayed exactly the same forever, the United States would be happy. And to be equally clear, China is not okay with the status quo, right? China would like the situation to be different. And so from the US perspective, it's like, guys, like everything's going really well, like don't mess this up for everybody. That is kind of the view. Like we've had free trade, like for the most part in Asia, you haven't had war. The view of the United States, I think, is that it is the US military presence that has reduce those conflictive tendencies, obviously coupled with international institutions and free trade, but the costs and threat of having to fight the US military has convinced countries in Asia not to go down this pathway of war. And that has been good for everyone. And it really is only sort of that big, to a degree, you have positive inducements on the econ and political side, but you also have that big stick. So you asked me, is deterrence the only way? My view is yes, but you have to take that with a grain of salt, because if you look at my background, I've made personal decisions that obviously show I believe in the effectiveness of force to resolve political problems. Otherwise, I wouldn't be 15 years of service in the U.S. military. So I tend to think that the military component and that threat of military intervention, which creates a deterrent situation, is why we've had peace to date. And so that's why I'm so sort of fixated on reestablishing it so we can have peace in the future. But I think many people from many different disciplines have other tools in their toolbox that would be as impactful, as important to bring to bear. And we do have to think more creatively about how to deal with this issue. So to end on the note we kind of started on, you should study these things more and then come up with a better answer 10 or 15 years from now.
Xueguang, final word?
Yes, come back to Tom's question about the state-society relationships. I always argued that the Chinese society participates in the political processes in its own way. It's not passive, it's not just accepting, but they are doing this through their behaviors, their attitudes in the workplace, their consumption decisions, their marriage decisions, their decisions whether to give birth or not. They are actively participating. We just need to look at the right place to find the right answers to it.
Well, I'm afraid we have to end there, but please join me in congratulating Chris one more time.
Congratulations.
Thank you.